We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Beth Saunders and Bill Fenimore. Beth Saunders is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. She has directed and produced diverse programs for broadcast on PBS and German television, including Fear and Favor in the Newsroom and Making the News Fit. Bill Fenimore is a Vietnam draft resistor who is one of the subjects in Beth's new documentary in progress, The Draft and the Vietnam War. Beth and Bill, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start out. What was the motivation, Beth, in you putting together this new documentary?
Well, I've had a lifelong interest in this. I graduated from high school in 1974, so the draft had ended, but I saw the impact that it had on people's lives. And politically, I became more and more fascinated by that whole process of that decision-making about what an individual had to do about the draft and the broader political implications. And why I'm doing it right now is because I lost a friend to cancer a couple of years ago, and he had an interesting story, and I thought, oh my goodness, we're losing this history. And so I better do a project now, and that's the motivation.
And how are you going about finding subjects for your documentary?
They're all over the place. It's not
yes, but how
hard.
do you identify them?
It's not hard. But I'm trying to get a range of folks, and I'm narrowing it to people who did oppose the war. There were draft dodgers, as you might have remembered. There are some prominent pro-war people who've been running our country who dodged the draft. But I'm not focusing on those folks. I'm focusing on the people who made a moral or a political commitment against the draft and the war.
And so do you put out like a cattle call that you're working on this, or is it just kind of word of mouth?
You know, I'm in the demographics that I just ask my friends, what's your draft story? And they're fascinating. Some of them are highly entertaining. Some of them are quite tragic and sad because it had an impact on the family dynamics. And it's not hard. There are certain demographics that I have not been able to explore, and the people who didn't register for the draft, they were so alienated from the mainstream culture that they didn't even bother registering for it. And they're not in the statistics. And I put a call out for folks that fit that category. And as of yet, I haven't filled that one. So it's a selection process of who's going to typify, but also bring something, will hit a highlight in the points that I think were shared by many, many people.
All right. And how did Bill get involved with this? Did you know Bill prior to the project?
Yep.
Beth and I are old friends.
Okay. So, Bill, talk about your situation. What was it? Paint us a picture. What was it like back when you had to make this decision?
So I graduated from high school in 1967 and had grown up in western Nebraska, a small town, and was not really exposed to the conversation in any significant way. It was simply an accepted thing that the Vietnam War was being fought for appropriate reasons, and that people were going to be drafted and were going to participate. And so when I graduated, I had one set of views, and I actually was able to sort of take advantage of the system, and I took an ROTC scholarship. I was on a full ride. Everything was paid for. And it wasn't until I actually got to the university and started talking to a slightly larger group of people and a broader set of thoughts that I started to question that. I found out in the course of that first year that that I wasn't willing to continue to support the war, and I found out that I could actually withdraw from that scholarship, and that seemed like a more arduous thing to do because you actually joined the Army to get the scholarship. And I can remember the point where I didn't know what the consequences were of withdrawing from the scholarship and sort of had to just take that leap because as far as I knew, that meant you're in the Army right now. And I didn't know what I would do, but I sort of had to take it a step at a time. And the first step was to decide I wasn't going to be an officer. The trajectory that I was on originally was not only was I going to be an officer, I was going to be a lawyer in the Army. And that would have been a great pathway in the sense that nobody would have been shooting bullets at me. I would have been safe. I would have been part of the machine that kept the thing going, and I simply couldn't do that. So I was at a point where I was no longer going to be an officer. I didn't know the consequences of that, but I knew that I had to take that first step.
And did you have friends who were taking similar steps?
You know, I think that's something that I've spent the most time recently because of my conversations with Beth thinking about. I really didn't. I really felt isolated. The people that I had gone to high school with weren't thinking this way. And the people that I was meeting at the university, represented a broader range of thought. But it was not that experience perhaps that people had here in Seattle of already being associated with a group or knowing that there was a group of like-minded people out there. I was trying to figure this out pretty much on my own.
And did you expect backlash from your friends? And what about your family as well?
This was something that was happening in the context of a whole bunch of changes. And so my expectation of my family was that they weren't going to support the decision I was making. And so at that point, I decided that I wasn't going to be in that conversation with them anymore. And I decided I'd make my own money and make my way forward on my own. And I was able to start working through a union ironworker position and started making my money that way. And at the end of my second year, so I'd spent 1 year in ROTC, 1 year not in ROTC, I realized that in the largest sense, I needed to be in a community that had a broader range of thought if I was ever going to figure out what I thought about a whole bunch of things. And the opportunity presented itself to transfer to McGill in Montreal, and so that's when I moved to Canada. So it wasn't this moment where I was sort of sneaking across the border. I was in this very, very fortunate position where I could continue to be in school, but find that broader community. And Montreal and McGill were perfect. It was wonderful.
For those that aren't familiar, which would be me for one, so that was a fairly liberal school?
McGill was a school that attracted people from all over the world. And so I met a set of friends. I was tasked to take beginning French. And so that particular classroom was full of people who were all in a similar situation. I never did learn French. But it was this great cross-section of people who were in Montreal, in Canada, from all over the world. And it gave me access to the range of thought that I was really craving.
And so did you expand beyond just yourself on these viewpoints? Did you join the larger movement towards resisting the war in Vietnam?
I did not. I eventually made the choice to immigrate to Canada. So and to do that, you cross back the border, and shaved off my beard. I kept my mustache, and a friend said, "Well, you're still hip. You have a mustache." And because I was an iron worker, I was able to describe myself as having work, and so I got a green card. And so there was never a point in there where I had either the wit or the opportunity to really be in a movement. I did have, obviously, I met lots of people who were resisting the draft and had plenty of opportunity to puzzle through this with them. But it was in the context of either living or actually immigrating to Canada.
And how did the U.S. government see you after you'd done this?
You know, the organized process was kind of pre-computer, and as a result, you know, was the opportunity to have the U.S. government even have an opinion was fairly modest, and really the only time that I ever directly discussed this with the U.S. government was I did cross back once. I went through Windsor, and I think that was Detroit, but I'm a little fuzzy on the facts. And in the middle of the night, spent some time talking to one of the immigration officers about the fact that I wasn't carrying a draft card. And they told me, well, we're going to inform your draft board. And, you know, as far as I was concerned, great, knock yourself out. But there was no real well-organized enforcement process. You were caught or you weren't caught, but it was pretty casual by comparison to what happens now when you go across the border.
Especially just with these revelations that have been coming in the last few months. What happens now when you walk in front of a surveillance camera? So when did you come back to the U.S. permanently?
Well, that was a bit of a. It was not this formal moment of final decision, but I had been living then in Vancouver in probably 75, and I was no longer in peril, in part because the lottery had separated out the people that were really at risk from everybody else, and the war was winding down, I believe. And so I found that I wanted to have work down here rather than up in BC, and was still in the Union. So I came back down, did some traveling, and ended up helping to build a dam in eastern Washington. And then came back, started living in Seattle, and then was actually working on the Kingdome, and I was up on a tower, and the tower fell down, and that was the last day I did ironwork.
So, Beth and Bill, jump in. What were the options available to people back when the draft was in play?
Yeah, it depended on what year. The draft laws changed, and some people were informed and some people weren't. But initially, in the very beginnings, like if you were married, like Dick Cheney got an exemption from being married. You had kids, and a study by Notre Dame grads were saying they were getting married, they were having kids intentionally to avoid the draft. And so there were conscious decisions. There was also vocational exemptions, which I found shocking that at least one book I read said there were more vocational exemptions than student deferments, which really surprised me. But for instance, teaching was one of those professions. And you saw a spike of males joining teaching schools, like 10% in 1 year in like 1965, I think it was, in New York, for instance. And part of that's probably because the profession was getting more established with or getting higher standards of pay and things like that. But, when 1 year, a 10% jump, it's pretty clear that some of those people are being motivated to avoid the draft. And then you had the CEO, but that status was a conscientious objector was given to you by your local draft board, and there were like 4,000 draft boards, and they applied these standards very erratically. And there was a Supreme Court case in '65 saying that you could get CO status without believing in God or belonging to a traditional pacifist church or sect, and that was not very well enforced. So it was hit and miss for a lot of these things. My cousin was in Seattle in '68, right when they stopped giving you an exemption for being married. And she had a small baby. She was with a man, and they actually moved every 2 to 3 months to avoid the draft board catching up with them. And again, this is pre-internet, pre-computerized system. And they did that for like 2 years with an infant moving every 2 to 3 months, which indicates there was cheap housing available in Seattle at the time. That people did lots of things like that. Medical deferments continued to be huge release for a lot of people. And I think Seattle became very popular for pre-induction medical exams because Seattle became known if you had a doctor's letter or a psychiatrist's letter that you would get an exemption. And this is after the lottery, so that even made it more valuable. But a lot of these options were very much, you had to be informed about what was going on, specifically in your draft board area. And you had to have resources. Like applying for a conscientious objector, you had to write why you didn't want to fight. And it was really demanding. If you don't have those skill sets, you're not going to do it. And so it was really geared for privileged kids with certain types of skills. Then you had people going underground, just going off the radar. And that worked for some people. And the breakdown in enforcement of the draft laws, I think, was one of the more shocking things when I started looking into this. Because towards the end, the U.S. attorneys nationally, if you did an average, of course it varied from place to place, but nationally, they dropped 90% of the draft violation cases. And towards the end, like a fourth of all on the criminal docket had to deal with draft cases. So it was really significant, the kind of resistance that was going on for kids to being drafted during the Vietnam War.
Didn't a lot of the conscientious objectors still have to end up serving? For instance, I know one who's now in the Seattle area, Ben Sherman. He became a conscientious objector and ended up being a medic in the war.
Oh, he served in the war?
I believe so.
I think when you're in the military, there could be a conscientious objector status within the military, but I haven't heard of a civilian who got conscientious objector head. You had to do alternative service. Like a friend was an orderly in a public health hospital back east for 2 years. And 65% of the people formally did their service. But I had another friend, again, getting back to the notion that things were just breaking down. He was in Massachusetts in a small town, and his local draft board just got gutted. The people who were on it was a volunteer position, and they were on the local draft board, but they were still subject to the civil service code where they had a mandated retirement at 65, and that just wiped out their local draft board. It was a very liberal part of Massachusetts. No one would volunteer for that draft board. And when he wanted his CO status, a secretary just stamped it for him because she couldn't be bothered with the paperwork and everything. So again, your options really depended on where you lived. Like in New Hampshire, they prosecuted like 95% of their draft cases. And people would go, if they had the resources, they would select where they would even appeal their draft case to make it more attractive. You could get your medical induction anywhere in the country. So you would select where was it the easiest to get any kind of exemption.
So those draft boards were key. It sounds like if you had a draft board that felt like everyone that comes before us needs to go serve,
Yep.
versus a draft board that possibly didn't agree with the war at all.
Well, they had quotas to fill too.
What was the penalty if they didn't fill the quota?
I don't know. Maybe their honor. I don't know what it was. I mean, it couldn't have been much.
So about 7 minutes left. So how key was the draft in affecting the peace movement?
I think it was huge. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that one way to measure that was how well the lottery worked, in the sense that it created a group of people who were not at peril, and therefore less, perhaps, certainly in my case, but less engaged by that that necessity to be a part of a resistance movement. And it, in some respects, it continues to define the benefit of not, for the government to not have a draft, because the way that we view things like the adventures in the Middle East are in part defined by our lack of personal involvement. And it's one, I think, of the lessons learned by the people in power, is that a draft which in a sense is fair is the last thing they want.
So do you think a lot of the resistance to the draft was from people just trying to save their own ass, or perhaps just because the whole system is so screwed up and they were seeing their friends sent over and ground up?
I don't think it was that binary. I think that most people who were involved in the draft resistance probably had the opportunity to personalize it, and also had a sense that they were making this as a means of taking back their country. In my own case, the despair, the sadness that I felt was that I felt like I had lost my country. I felt like I had lost my community, because I was, I wasn't in connection with anything like an organized resistance movement, and realized that everything that I had been told up to that point had led me to make a terrible choice. And in my case, a choice that I was fortunate enough to be able to undo. But it also left me feeling completely separate from anything like my familiar community, and kind of a symbol, but also a very real expression of that was I left the country, and in coming back for a long time, didn't feel like I was connected to the community.
I think that was a common, too, when talking to folks, that this really split their kind of, it fueled a kind of an alienation with the mainstream culture. And there was a huge cultural shift, and it wasn't just the draft, but the draft certainly was a major focal point of a lot of outrage about what was happening and the immorality. And I think the draft, the focus of it was very evident when you had hundreds of raids on draft boards and destroying files. And some of those people were people with religious convictions, and some it was a political choice. But you had 3,000 people went to prison for draft evasion issues. And it was much more at the beginning of the war, and they were targeting leaders, and they were trying to wipe out the most effective activists at that time. And one of these people that was caught into that, who served prison, is Bruce Dansis, and I'm interviewing him. Hopefully, if my Kickstarter campaign goes well, I will be going down to Sacramento and interviewing him. But his perception of it is kind of interesting because he felt very frustrated at that time of the effectiveness of the peace movement. It's only later when you have the biographies coming out from a lot of the military planners and the politicians who are able to say, yeah, the peace movement had an effect on how we executed policy. So it's interesting now to reflect on some of those decisions because you have different type of information to have a broader perspective on how effective the draft and the peace movement was. I think it was enormously effective.
Just a couple minutes left. So you mentioned Kickstarter. Could you talk about that? You are an award-winning documentary producer. You have to go to Kickstarter these days to do projects like this?
Yep. The foundation sources for money has dried up. Distribution, you can't rely on a distribution income stream to help finance stuff. It's all up in the air right now. And yes, I'm doing a Kickstarter campaign, The Draft and the Vietnam Generation, and people can go and just Google that, and any support that they can give us would be very appreciated.
And you have a website that links to your Kickstarter page, the thedraftproject.com, is that right?
Yeah.
As well as, you have a blog on there with...
I have a blog. I've tried to do Facebook, which again, the Facebook page is thedraftproject.com. They wouldn't let me fit my whole title in, but yeah, I'm kind of new to that, but I'm having a lot of fun. And it seems like when people retire, that's a great way of connecting with people who've gone through this experience, because it was a very emotionally charged time. My aunt, when she saw the Kickstarter video, she's going to be 90. She just emailed me back 2 sentences saying, like, this brought back a wave of anxiety because she had true draft eligible boys during that time period. And I will say part of the experience is that it was uncertain for a lot of people. They did not have a clear-cut answer to how they were going to be either exempt. Some people did get a clear cut, but a lot of people got temporary, like a student deferment or this. It wasn't, they didn't feel safe for the entire Vietnam War period.
You mentioned that people, at least in the beginning, could get out of serving, avoiding the draft if they were having children. So were there draft babies, like red diaper babies?
Yeah, I'm sure
people
there
that just had babies just to get out. All right. With that,
you'll have to ask people like Dick Cheney. That's why he had kids.
Oh. Somehow that doesn't surprise me. With that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you both very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to do it.